May 29th, 1943, Attu Island, Alaska. In the dim pre-dawn light and swirling fog, a sudden cry of "Banzai!" pierced the frigid air. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers burst out of the mist and rain, charging furiously down Engineer Hill with bayonets fixed. Exhausted American sentries, many of them weakened by cold and hunger, were caught off guard. Moments earlier, Company B of the U.S. 32nd Infantry had been trudging off for a hot breakfast, leaving only a few lookouts on the line. Now they scrambled back in shock as the enemy overran their outposts. It was the start of a desperate last-ditch Japanese attack, one of the largest Banzai charges of the Pacific War. The thin American front buckled under the sudden onslaught. In the chaos, Japanese troops sliced through the U.S. perimeter and even reached a support camp in the rear. What ensued was a nightmare, a madness of noise and confusion and deadliness, recalled Captain George Bueller of the 32nd Infantry. On that remote, windswept Alaskan island, amid swirling fog and mud, Americans and Japanese clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat for survival. American engineers, medics, and support personnel on top of Engineer Hill grabbed rifles and grenades to mount a hasty defense. General Archibald Arnold rallied cooks, stretcher-bearers, anyone who could fight, to form a ragged line. They opened up with grenades and small arms at the charging enemy. Still, the Japanese came on relentlessly, many preferring death to the dishonor of surrender under their samurai Bushido code. Wave after wave of screaming attackers smashed into the improvised American line. The defenders fought back ferociously with bayonets and rifle butts in close quarters, determined to hold the high ground. After critical minutes of fierce melee, the tide finally turned. A detachment of the 50th U.S. Engineers arrived as reinforcements and counterattacked, driving the Japanese back from the brink with cold steel and concentrated rifle fire. By afternoon, the Banzai assault had been quelled. Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, the Japanese commander who led the charge, lay dead among his men. The battlefield fell eerily quiet. The final attack of the Battle of Attu had been repulsed, and nearly the entire Japanese force on the island was annihilated in the process. Thus ended a bloody 18-day struggle on a tiny speck of land in the North Pacific, the only World War II land battle fought on North American soil. This forgotten clash on frozen Attu Island was in many ways as horrific as better-known battles in the Pacific. Yet many Americans today have never heard of it. To understand how U.S. and Japanese soldiers came to fight to the death on a barren Alaskan island, we must turn back the calendar one year, to the desperate days of 1942. Invasion of the Aleutians. Japan grabs American soil. June 7th, 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Japanese troops landed on Attu and seized it, along with its neighbor Kiska, at the far western end of the Aleutian Island chain. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign invaders had occupied American soil. Attu, a volcanic scrap of tundra 1,200 miles from the Alaskan mainland, had belonged to the United States since the purchase of Alaska in 1867. It was sparsely inhabited, home to a few dozen Unangax Aleut indigenous people and a couple of American civilians. These Attu villagers were taken prisoner by the Japanese and shipped off to camps in Japan. Out of 40 Aleut captives, 16 died in captivity from disease and starvation. News that Japanese forces had planted the rising sun flag on U.S. territory, no matter how remote, stunned and enraged Americans. Many feared this might be a prelude to an attack on mainland Alaska, or the U.S. Pacific Northwest. In the summer of 1942, with the nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor and fighting for survival at Midway and in the South Pacific, the Japanese Aleutian occupation was a blow to American morale. Why did Japan invade these bleak, far-flung islands? Historians generally agree it was a diversionary tactic, part of the Japanese plan to draw U.S. naval forces away during their simultaneous attack on Midway in June 1942. By seizing Attu and Kiska, the Japanese hoped to threaten U.S. positions in Alaska and perhaps deter an American advance along the Aleutian chain toward Japan's home islands. Strategically, the Aleutian occupation achieved little for Japan once Midway ended in disaster for their fleet. But Tokyo committed to holding the islands, turning the Aleutians into a sideshow theater of World War II. In the initial months after Attu and Kiska were taken, American forces were stretched thin and could spare few resources for the frozen Northwest. U.S. war planners, prioritizing the South Pacific and Europe, at first paid relatively little attention to the Japanese garrisons on these desolate rocks. Apart from occasional bombing raids launched from distant Alaska airfields, the Japanese on Attu and Kiska were left largely unmolested through late 1942. This Aleutian lull ended by early 1943 as the U.S. built up strength and turned an eye back to reclaiming its lost territory. In March 1943, the U.S. Navy won our Neighbor Splash in the frigid waters of the Bering Sea, the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands, securing sea lanes and paving the way for an amphibious assault on Attu. Plans were laid for Operation Landgrab, the code name for retaking Attu. Operation Landgrab, assault on a frozen fortress. Before dawn on May 11th, 1943, the American liberation of Attu began. Under cover of fog and naval bombardment, approximately 11,000 U.S. troops of the 7th Infantry Division landed on Attu's beaches from the north and south. The invasion force, composed largely of soldiers from California who had trained in sunny Hawaii, now found themselves wading ashore into a subarctic wasteland. Attu greeted them with howling 40-mile-an-hour winds, icy rain, and dense fog that limited visibility to a few yards. The landscape was treeless, a dreary expanse of sodden tundra and jagged ridges. Colonel Yamasaki, commanding the Japanese garrison, had wisely withdrawn his 2,500 troops from the beaches and dug into the high ground inland. Thus, the initial American landings met only light resistance. Many young GIs wondered if the Japanese had perhaps abandoned the island, a hopeful illusion that would soon vanish. As the Americans pushed inland, Attu itself became as fearsome an enemy as the Japanese. The battle that unfolded over the next 2.5 weeks was defined by impossible terrain and brutal weather. The island's mountains and valleys were a natural fortress. Thick fog could give way without warning to blinding snow or torrential sleet. Gale force winds up to 100 miles per hour screamed down from the peaks. The cold was bone deep and constant. One account of the battle noted that Attu is a barren, treeless volcanic island with weather that can change quickly from still winds and light fog to raging 100-mile-an-hour gusts and driving rain. American troops, expecting a quick victory in spring conditions, were outfitted with inadequate gear, thin field jackets, standard leather boots, and tents that collapsed in the gales. They were not prepared for a winter-like campaign in mud, snow, and ice. Exposure and frostbite soon began taking a toll. Soldiers who got wet and could not dry out developed trench foot, a gruesome condition where flesh decays from constant cold and dampness. Exposure to the drenching rains and freezing cold inflicted more casualties than enemy fire, one history notes, as hundreds of U.S. troops suffered trench foot, hypothermia, and even gangrene. In fact, during the battle, over 2,100 Americans were put out of action by illness and non-battle injuries, far exceeding the roughly 1,700 U.S. combat casualties from Japanese bullets or shells. The men grimly joked that the Aleutian weather was doing more damage than the Emperor's soldiers. Attu's Japanese defenders, meanwhile, had spent nearly a year fortifying and acclimating to the environment. They dug networks of foxholes and burrowed into hillsides. Camouflaged sniper pits covered likely American approaches. Yamasaki's strategy was to compensate for being vastly outnumbered, his 2,500 men against an invading force 5 times as large, by using the terrain to maximum advantage. Rather than opposing the beach landings, the Japanese lay hidden in the heights, prepared to ambush and snipe at the advancing Americans. For days, the GIs trudged forward slowly, scouring every ravine and rocky crag for concealed enemies. It was rugged. The whole damn deal was rugged, like attacking a pillbox by way of a tightrope. In winter, recalled Lieutenant Donald Dwinnell, vividly describing the difficulty of assaulting well-entrenched positions in the icy mountains. The Americans had to fight not only enemy gunfire, but slippery cliffs, knee-deep mud, and perpetual cold. Every step forward was paid for in blood and misery. Japanese troops would lie motionless in foxholes for hours, and suddenly cut loose with a burst of machine gun or mortar fire when the Americans drew near. Small skirmishes flared in the fog, then just as quickly faded as the Japanese melted back into hidden positions. There were few large, pitched battles on Attu. It was more often a deadly cat-and-mouse struggle, fought in whiteout mist and among mossy gullies, where one never knew when a camouflage sniper might be a few yards away. The Americans soon realized that the environment was as lethal as the enemy. An infantryman's day on Attu typically meant being soaked to the bone in freezing rain, stumbling over slick tundra muskeg, or through snowdrifts, all while under threat of sniper fire. Men had to keep moving to stay warm, even if it meant exposing themselves to enemy fire. Those who could not walk crawled, wrote one officer of the relentless cold. Some soldiers became so desperate for warmth that they stripped better clothing off dead Japanese troops, a dangerous gambit, as a GI wearing parts of a Japanese uniform risked being shot by his own side. Food was another constant concern. Supply lines were hampered by weather. Thick fog grounded supply planes for days. Rations ran low. Hungry U.S. soldiers sometimes resorted to chucking grenades into the frigid sea to stun fish for food. One American unit went for 5 days without resupply when aircraft couldn't locate them in the Aleutian fog. The Japanese were faring no better on meager scavenged rations. One Japanese army surgeon on Attu, Major Paul Nobuo Tatsuguchi, noted in his diary on May 28th that he had ate half-dried thistle plants. The first fresh food he'd tasted in months, a delicacy in those starving conditions. Both the invaders and the defenders were nearing the limits of human endurance as May wore on. Courage in a frozen hell, heroes of Attu. Despite the dreadful conditions, acts of remarkable courage shone through the gloom on Attu. Ordinary soldiers found themselves performing extraordinary feats. One such hero was Private Joseph P. Martinez of Company K, 32nd Infantry Regiment. A 22-year-old draftee from Colorado, Private Martinez would earn the Medal of Honor, posthumously, for his valor on Attu, becoming the first Hispanic American to receive that honor in World War II. On May 26, 1943, Martinez's company was pinned down by ferocious Japanese fire at a narrow, snow-choked mountain pass nicknamed Fishhook Ridge. Repeated American attacks on this high defensive position had failed over several days. Now, a coordinated assault by an entire battalion struggled to gain ground under withering machine gun and mortar fire. Seeing his comrades falter, Private Martinez decided to act. In the words of his Medal of Honor citation, Private Martinez, an automatic rifleman, rose to his feet and resumed his advance, despite the storm of enemy fire. Charging up the slope alone, he fired his Browning automatic rifle from the hip, silencing one enemy machine gun nest, then another. Inspired by his one-man assault, fellow soldiers jumped up and followed his lead. Martinez kept going, scrambling up the cliffs and tossing grenades into foxholes. He personally cleared out multiple Japanese bunkers that had been holding up the advance. Even after exhausting his BAR's ammo, Martinez grabbed an M1 Garand rifle and continued the attack. According to one comrade, he went on like a wild man, a tornado that day. Martinez made it all the way to the lip of the pass, having almost single-handedly broken the Japanese position. At the final trench, just below the ridge's peak, a bullet struck him in the head, mortally wounding him. Private Martinez died shortly after, but his heroic charge had turned the tide. Fish Hook Ridge was captured, opening the way for U.S. forces to advance. For his selfless courage, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. The First World War Medal of Honor action to occur on American soil. Martinez's bravery that day epitomized the grit and sacrifice of the soldiers fighting on Attu's frozen battlefields. There were countless lesser-known acts of heroism and endurance. Medics risked their lives to treat wounded men under fire on those icy slopes. Artillery forward observers clung to exposed hilltops in gale winds to direct naval gunfire onto enemy pillboxes. Even amid the misery, the soldiers kept faith that they would reclaim this piece of America. Slowly but steadily, by late May, the Americans gained the upper hand. After bitter, close-quarters fights, they seized key high points dominating the island: Holt's Bay, then Fish Hook Ridge, then adjacent heights nicknamed Buffalo Ridge and Engineer Hill. By May 28th, the Japanese were forced into a shrinking pocket on the island's western end in a valley near Chichagof Harbor. U.S. forces effectively cornered the remaining enemy against the sea. Colonel Yamasaki's situation was now hopeless. Of the roughly 2,600 Japanese troops he had when the battle began, nearly two-thirds were dead by May 28th. Only about 800 soldiers were still fit for combat, and another 600 lay wounded, many grievously. The Americans had taken the high ground and were preparing to bring up heavy artillery to blast the final Japanese positions the next day. Yamasaki knew that defeat was inevitable. For the Japanese army indoctrinated in the Bushido Code, surrender was out of the carrier for my supper. It was considered a disgrace worse than death. The trapped Japanese soldiers were prepared to die to the last man. As night fell on May 28th, the Japanese commander made a fateful decision. They would launch a surprise counterattack, a suicide charge, in the darkness, hoping to break through the American lines, or at least die honorably in battle. It was a desperate gambit, born of Bushido's zeal and last-chance recklessness. In their bunkers that night, Japanese officers passed the word: prepare for a final Banzai attack. The wounded who could still walk armed themselves with grenades and bayonets. Those too injured to move were given morphine overdoses or grenades to end their lives. Major Tatsuguchi, the U.S.-educated Japanese surgeon, made his final diary entry. There are continuous cases of suicide. Heard they gave 400 shots of morphine to kill wounded, he noted. The last assault is to be carried out. Only 33 years of living and I am to die here. At 1800 hours, took care of all the patients with grenades. Goodbye, Taiki, my beloved wife, who loved me to the last, Tatsuguchi wrote on May 28, 1943. The doctor had studied in California and was a Christian convert, yet here he was, bidding farewell and preparing to die for the emperor on a god-forsaken Aleutian island. His farewell note to his wife would later be found on his body. With everything in readiness, Colonel Yamasaki and his men silently assembled in the early hours of May 29th, awaiting the signal to charge. The final Banzai and the price of victory. Just before 3 a.m. on May 29th, 1943, the stillness over Attu shattered as Yamasaki's force of perhaps 1,000 Japanese, including wounded, bandaged soldiers hobbling forward, launched their ferocious Banzai charge. Under cover of fog and dim dawn light, they achieved complete surprise. They poured through a gap in the American lines left open when U.S. troops moved to get breakfast, as described earlier. In wedge formation, screaming, "Tenno Heika Banzai!" Long live the Emperor, 10,000 years. They rushed straight at the American positions on Engineer Hill. The sheer shock of this human wave attack in the darkness sent tremors of panic through the U.S. camp. Japanese assault teams overran several frontline foxholes, bayoneting the occupants, and surged toward the American rear areas. Some penetrated so deep that they encountered lightly armed service troops, cooks, clerks, and medics, who were utterly startled to find enemy soldiers in their midst. Amid the fog, confusion reigned. It was often impossible to tell friend from foe in the melee. Groups of Japanese broke into U.S. supply depots and artillery emplacements, killing whoever they found. It seemed for a short time that the entire American beachhead might be in jeopardy of collapse. Yet the Americans did not break. Despite the shock and initial chaos, ad hoc groups of U.S. soldiers quickly rallied to contain the breach. On Engineer Hill, anyone who could hold a rifle took up a defensive position. Rear echelon troops, hospital, orderlies, construction engineers, radio men suddenly became frontline fighters. Intense close combat raged across the hilltop as dawn came. In some cases, Japanese soldiers who had feigned death the day before sprang up to join the carnage behind American lines. Grenades exploded amid tents and trench works. Scattered rifle shots rang out in all directions. A band of Japanese charged a U.S. artillery battery, only to be met by a swarm of defenders in a wild hand-to-hand fight. An American surgeon, Major Jack Weitzel, shot several charging enemies with a pistol outside his field hospital tent before falling wounded. Another Army doctor, Captain Casal Bliss, rallied litter bearers and drivers into a makeshift line that held off one wing of the Japanese attack long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Slowly, through raw courage and superior numbers, the Americans contained and then crushed the Banzai charge. As the morning wore on, organized Japanese resistance faded. Groups of fanatical attackers had expended themselves in suicidal fashion. Many who weren't cut down by American fire chose to end their lives with their own grenades pressed to their stomachs, as per Bushido indoctrination. By the end of May 29, virtually all of the Japanese on Attu were dead. Of roughly 2,500 Japanese troops present at the start of battle, more than 2,000 bodies were found littering the island's ridges and valleys. Fewer than 30 dazed Japanese survivors, many of them wounded, were taken prisoner. A tiny handful who either had been knocked unconscious or otherwise unable to kill themselves. Colonel Yamasaki was found among the fallen, his sword clasped in his hand. American burial details later interred 2,351 Japanese corpses in mass graves on Attu, and likely a few hundred more remained buried in collapsed bunkers or blown-apart trenches. The Japanese garrison had been literally wiped out to a man. American casualties, while far lighter than the enemy's, were still tragically high. Approximately 549 Americans were killed and 1,148 wounded in the Attu operation. Many of these losses occurred in those final 24 hours of frenzied combat. In fact, the Battle of Attu would go down as one of the most costly U.S. assaults in the Pacific War relative to the numbers engaged, a second deadliest battle by proportion of forces, ranking just behind Iwo Jima. On Attu, as noted, there were also more than 1,800 non-combat casualties, disease and injury, which means total U.S. casualties exceeded the number of Japanese defenders, a testament to how vicious the conditions were. After the Banzai attack was repelled, scattered fighting continued into May 30th as a few isolated Japanese holdouts were hunted down. By noon of May 30th, 1943, Attu Island was declared secure. American troops gazed around at the ghastly scene. The tundra was strewn with bodies, wrecked weapons, and debris. Investigating the enemy's last stronghold, U.S. soldiers made a grisly discovery in a captured Japanese field hospital. All the Japanese wounded had been executed by their own medics or comrades as part of the final suicide orders. Dr. Tatsuguchi himself was found dead, pistol in hand, near the remains of his patients. The Americans were both awed and appalled by the enemy's fanatical refusal to surrender. Aftermath: a forgotten victory. The hard-fought American victory at Attu reclaimed the first piece of U.S. soil taken by the Axis in World War II. In the spring of 1943, this news was greeted with celebration back home. Headlines announced the liberation of Attu, giving Americans a morale boost that the enemy had been expelled from American territory. Strategically, the Battle of Attu also had an important effect. The Japanese Navy, fearing for the security of the northern flank, diverted warships to the North Pacific in May 1943, which indirectly aided Allied offensives elsewhere in the Pacific, such as in the Solomon Islands. With Attu recaptured, the U.S. military set its sights on the remaining Japanese foothold in the Aleutians, Kiska Island. But when a large joint American-Canadian invasion force landed on Kiska in mid-August 1943, they were in for a surprise. The Japanese had secretly evacuated Kiska 3 weeks earlier under cover of fog, conceding the Aleutian Islands entirely. The Allies seized Kiska without a fight, at least without an enemy to fight. Tragically, in the thick fog and tension of that landing, Allied troops fired on each other by mistake, and numerous booby traps were left behind. In the confusion, there were over 100 Allied casualties on Kiska from friendly fire, accidents, and mines, all on an empty island. It was a bitter reminder of how the Aleutian environment could kill even when the Japanese were gone. By the end of summer 1943, the Aleutian Islands were back in Allied hands, and the threat to Alaska and the U.S. mainland was eliminated. The campaign in this remote theater had lasted over a year, cost thousands of lives, and taught harsh lessons. The Battle of Attu in particular revealed deficiencies in U.S. preparedness for extreme cold weather warfare. It prompted the Army to develop better cold weather gear, boots, tents, and rations. Changes that would benefit soldiers later fighting in other cold climates. Yet, for all its sacrifice and significance, Attu quickly faded from the spotlight, overshadowed by the massive ongoing campaigns in Guadalcanal, Sicily, and later Normandy. The tale of this frozen Alaskan battlefield did not receive the same level of historical attention. Veterans of Attu returned home telling of a place few Americans had ever heard of, much less could pronounce correctly. In the broader narrative of World War II, Attu became known as the Forgotten Battle. Forgotten or not, Attu remains a singular chapter in American military history. It stands as the only World War II ground battle on American soil, and a testament to the extreme conditions that soldiers endured in defense of their country. For the aging American veterans and Aleutian residents who remember, the scars of that fight, frostbite scars on flesh, and the emotional scars of losing comrades, have never fully faded. Today, Attu Island is uninhabited and its battlefield silent, save for the Arctic wind rustling over war relics, slowly sinking into the tundra, the rusty hulks of Japanese artillery, and the scattered remains of foxholes still dot the landscape, preserved by the cold as eerie reminders. In 1985, the Attu battlefield was declared a U.S. National Historic Landmark, though few venture to this distant site. For Americans, especially those over 65 who grew up in the aftermath of World War II, the story of Attu is a poignant example of the hidden costs of that global conflict. It's a story of young men from Texas and Colorado, New York, and California, shipped off to fight and die on a wind-lashed island thousands of miles from home. It's the story of indigenous Aleut villagers whose lives were upended by forces far beyond their control. It's the story of Japanese soldiers who, bound by duty and indoctrination, chose death over surrender in a futile cause. And it's a story of resilience. The American troops' determination to reclaim every inch of their nation's soil, no matter how harsh the climate or how high the price. In the end, the Battle of Attu exemplified the extremes of World War II's reach, that even a tiny frozen island in Alaska could become a fulcrum of sacrifice. For 18 days in May 1943, hell froze over on Attu. When the guns finally fell silent, nearly 4,000 human beings lay dead in that bleak wilderness. Attu was secured at the cost of much blood and suffering, and the Japanese tide that had reached Alaska's shores was turned back. The battle may be little known, but it deserves to be remembered. As we reflect on the bravery and endurance shown on Attu, we honor all those who fought in history's greatest war, even in its most remote and forgotten corners. The veterans of Attu would later say that no matter how far away that island was, it was American soil, and we took it back. Their victory, hard won and long overlooked, stands as a testament to the unyielding spirit of those who fought in World War II's most inhospitable battlefield. The forgotten battle on American